In political philosophy, we are trying to unpack the whole idea of the legitimacy of government. Is government even justified, or is it a bad habit? In political philosophy, we're asking a couple of pretty basic questions. Is the well-being of the state more important than the well-being of the individual citizens it serves, or vice versa? Are the citizens more important than the state? So, for instance, if by way of analogy, you get gangrene in your toe, we feel justified in sacrificing the toe for the sake of the whole body. Well, does that analogy apply when we're talking about government and individuals? That if individuals or a group of individuals is somehow determined to be threatening to the life of the body, are they sacrificed? And even if it isn't quite that serious, if it's just not to the benefit of the body, do we resist what is good for just a few of the citizens? Or vice versa, no, if the citizens aren't being served, then the state is just a creation that we have to, revamp, as it were. So the other question then is the state a divine creation we must not question, or simply a contract between people that is subject to change? So is the state, when we say a divine creation, you don't have to mean that it's created by God, but is it like a divine creation? In other words, it's good, right, and must be, and you shouldn't even think about it, questioning it. Or is it a man-made thing that is simply a contract that can be amended or eliminated if it's not holding up to the deal that was originally made? So this is an interesting question here when we are pitting the individual versus the collective, because as you will recall from other videos, our autonomy is essential, as many philosophers have suggested, essential to what it means to be human. So the state must take into account its responsibility to individuals, and it should not ever, no matter how big it is, take away the autonomy of its individuals, that people should be left to ultimately make decisions for themselves. Or, as we will see, others will argue that's ultimately foolish, that no person is an island. You have to learn to live within the collective, or you won't survive at all. Well, okay, so that's where we're going here. We're going to look at the two different ways of looking at this. One that says the state is the most important, and the other that says, no, the individual is. So Aristotle is quoted as saying, man, when perfected, is the best of all animals, but when separated from law and justice, he is the worst. And law and justice, of course, are the products of rational thinking, thus the products of human beings. But he is saying that essentially human beings are self-centered, is probably the best way to say it, but that it requires law and justice to manage humankind, because without it, what it all boils down to is you're going to have a very smart animal on your hands. then when we jump up from that classical period up to the Enlightenment, and you have a guy like Rousseau quoted as saying, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." What he's implying here is that we are essentially good, and that we have imposed all kinds of unnecessary rules upon human beings, which has the effect of distorting human beings and bringing out the worst in them. So we have to find that balance, according to Rousseau, because humans are essentially good. Well, all right. So let's begin with those that feel the state is the most important. And to that we turn to the classical philosophers, and this was their position. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle believed that the state was the highest form of human social development. I mean, it was the most brilliant expression of the greatest creatures on earth. That's how they felt about it. And they believed that the happiness of the individual ultimately depended on the health of the state. Now, it's important to realize that with Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, they were on the scene right after their city-state, Athens, had lost the war to the Spartans. And they believed that the idea of individualism had crept into their society and weakened them. And that's why they succumbed to the Spartans, who, we even say today, so-and-so lives a very Spartan life. That means it's very much like the Stoics in that he's just, the Spartan attitude is to be very disciplined, don't ask why, do what you're told, follow the rules, and avoid luxury, and be a part of the team. So they're thinking they must be onto something because they won the war. So how do we do that? All right, well, Plato says in his famous work, The Republic, he addresses this problem and he says, well, the Spartans are sort of on the right track, but the real way to set up a society, or the polis, as it is referred to in the Greek, the way to set it up is to realize that the state or the republic, what happens in society is the structures of society evolve to reflect what it is to be a human being. In other words, the state is a human being on a grander scale, writ large, as we say. So that the state has a mind, has a spirit, has a body, so to speak, that relates to the way a human being does. And these are reflected by the three classes that Plato says must exist in any properly operating society. And we have a whole video devoted to just this idea, these ideas of the Republic of Plato, where you have the ruling class operating as like the mind, and the military class, which is the spirited self and in control of that seat of action and decision making, and then the working class, which is reflective of the lower appetitive drives, that which keeps things alive, but is in a sense the most mindless. And so Plato is saying you got to have these structures in place and operating to have a well-functioning society. Okay, well, that kind of assumes that you've got these wonderful people in the ruling class that are going to make all the right decisions all the time, and then thus you'll wind up with a happy world. Well, there's a lot of people over here on the other side who are going to say, no, the individual is the bottom line, and they are the Contractarians that came about in the time of the Enlightenment, are a great example of just this sort of thinking. Now, Thomas Hobbes, who is well, one of the earliest of the contractarians. Some don't even like to refer to him as a contractarian, but he begins by saying, in a sort of materialist way, that the state of nature is anarchy. In other words, there's nothing in us that makes government happen naturally. If we were left to our own devices, there would just be anarchy. But what we do is we begin to see that as we live in groups, these rules start to emerge. And no matter where you go on planet Earth at any time, if you've got a group of people, they've got some kind of government. They've got rules that people have to abide by. And so Hobbes says, let's take a look at this. He says, if by nature we don't have anything in us that is going to express itself in an orderly fashion, then the downside of that is that you're living according to the law of the jungle. In other words, you could be devoured or eliminated at any time. And that doesn't make for a very happy life, and it doesn't make for human beings thriving unless we realize that we have to work together to stay alive. And so we quite naturally make laws that say you can't, for instance, kill, or you don't sleep well at night. And as long as we have that rule in place, then we feel a lot better about life. And so Hobbes then is saying, look, survival is our only natural right. The will to live, to want to be alive, that is built into us. And so that's what, if nothing else, that is what law does. And as Hobbes felt like, that's about all it can do. It can maintain peace, not necessarily justice. It can't make sure everything's fair for everybody, but what law can do is keep us from killing one another and thus maintaining peace. And so government emerges amongst us, Hobbes would say, as this big Leviathan, which is a big monster from the ocean, like Godzilla, that just comes out and starts controlling things. It emerges from amongst us, and it's bigger than any individual. And we prefer it to anarchy. It's the lesser of evils, and it allows us to live. But you don't sit down at the table with Leviathan and hammer out the details of how things are going to be worked out. You just have to realize that it's there, and you got to put up with it and work around it, make sure Leviathan doesn't step on you, or hope it doesn't. Okay, and so why would we in this society, as Hobbes, this minimalist view of how societies are structured, why do we observe laws at all? Well, because it's reasonable. Out of a law of reason, what he means is it makes sense. You want to make it makes sense to abide by the laws because you will live longer if you do. That's really, in a nutshell, Hobbes's position. And so it's a brief contract, a brief social contract that Hobbes suggested, but nonetheless, it's a kind of understanding that it's a man-made thing, and that's the thing that we want to remember about contractarians. Well, then we move on to the great John Locke. His writings eventually influenced the American founding fathers. And he steps in and starts by saying, look, authority, no matter where you find it, begins with God. It comes from God. It's rooted in God and what God says. So if God says government is good, then, by God, government is good. And he goes on to talk about inalienable rights. Or which is another way of saying natural rights. Just when you look at who we are, what should every individual have a right to and never be taken away, no matter if everybody else in the world wants to take it away from this person. What rights are there that no one has the right to take away? Locke goes on to say, well, you have the right to life, to happiness, and so forth. But the interesting one is he says we have the right to stuff. We have the right to anything that we have created with our bodies that wouldn't exist if it weren't for us as individuals. That stuff is yours. It's an extension of your body, and you have a right to it, and no one can take that away. Now, he also says that God gives us an innate sense of morality, so you don't have to learn what is moral or not moral, according to John Locke. God gives that to you, and you can recognize what is right and wrong. And of course, you can see that for many, even today, this is an assumption that not everybody buys into. But the upshot of this is that the state is created by people for the people. It is for the people. And if the state fails in its responsibility to service the people, then you get rid of it, or you amend it, you change it, you alter it. It's just a thing created by people, so the people have to take responsibility for it. Well, all right, when you get down to Rousseau, who wrote The Social Contract in 1762, which influenced probably more than anyone else the French Revolution, Jean-Jacques Rousseau begins by saying, we are born free. In other words, when we're born, there are no rules that are naturally imposed upon us. We have to learn the rules. And it's a noble quality of human beings to be able to learn how to live together. In fact, as we have here on the second point, we learn to relinquish our individual desires to the general will of the majority. As long as we are voting participants in the system, when the vote doesn't go our way, we still celebrate that the general will was served and that the whole process is working. We still embrace the goodness of the whole system, but we have to keep in mind that what we are naturally is always going to be in a little bit of tension with what we come up with, what we create for society, because power tends to gravitate toward a privileged class. And the more privileged a group of people becomes, the more they begin to create rules that ensure their flourishing, often to the disadvantage of others. And so Rousseau says, and this is what happens time and time again, and people become weighted down with unnecessary rules that that thwart them and distort them in an unnatural way. And so we need to be conscientious all the time of maintaining this balance. But in the end, it's a social contract that we have created. Well, John Stuart Mill sees, okay, that's all well and good, but we have a problem here when we realize that some people who are in poverty did nothing to deserve it and often have no way to get out from under it. In the same way that a lot of people who are wealthy just inherited it or were plain lucky, and they don't necessarily deserve it, and they can be the type of people that abuse it or misuse it. So he's sort of the father in political philosophy, what referred to as liberalism, not to be confused with being politically liberal, but rather emphasizing the ideas of liberty and freedom and how important that was. For John Stuart Mill, He's agreeing with Immanuel Kant in the sense that he's saying our autonomy is something that should never be taken away. When you take away a human being's autonomy, their ability to make decisions for themselves, that kind of freedom, when you take that away, people become less, just a little less human, little less psychologically healthy. So you just don't want to do that. We are essentially human beings that need to have that sense of autonomy. So government, if we're going to make a deal, we want to make sure that it protects our autonomy. And so Mill distinguishes between public and private issues. Whatever you do in private is your business. If you want to ride your motorcycle while you're drunk and naked in the privacy of your domain, go ahead, as long as it doesn't impinge on anybody else's rights. But as soon as your private activities spill out onto the public domain and create a problem for somebody else, then we have to limit your what you can do in private. If your drunk driving throws you out the window and you've hit somebody on the sidewalk, see, we got a problem. Or if the noise from it keeps people from sleeping or whatever, you see, your rights as an individual stop where they begin to leak out into the public arena. Well, but if they don't, and what is private to you, no majority of vote should allow the government into private affairs. Keep the government out of private affairs, because once they get into it, what they're doing is squelching the human spirit. Individual happiness is essential to the general happiness. Well, all right. So when you take all the assumptions of the two sides and compare them, that's where you begin to then delve back into these questions of, is the well-being of the state more important than the well-being of the citizens it serves? And you can see in certain societies that have leaned one way or the other, and you can see the consequences and not necessarily draw conclusions from that. No society is a perfect reflection of any philosophy. These things are hard to work out in reality, but they can be indicators of the impact of either way of looking at things.